A lone widow opened her heart and home to 20 freezing bikers caught in a merciless winter storm, never imagining her simple act of kindness would change her life forever. The next morning, she trembled at the sight of 1,000 Hells Angels motorcycles lining her quiet street, their engines roaring like thunder against the snow-covered landscape. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. Cold winds howled across the outskirts of a small town in Indiana, rattling the windows of Mary Johnson's weathered farmhouse. The bitter January air found every crack in the century-old structure, seeping through worn window frames and beneath the warped front door. Mary stood by the frosted glass, her thin fingers clutching a faded blue shawl that had once belonged to her mother. Outside, snow swirled beneath the sickly yellow porch light, the only beacon in an otherwise pitch-black countryside. At 72, Mary's shoulders carried the invisible weight of mounting bills and repairs she couldn't afford. The property taxes alone threatened to take what little she had left. She watched her breath form small clouds in the unheated living room, too conscious of the dwindling firewood stack to light the hearth this early in the evening. It had been 15 years since her husband, Robert Johnson, passed away suddenly from a heart attack while fixing their tractor. 15 years of waking up to emptiness, of talking to photographs, of watching their once thriving farm slowly surrender to time and neglect. Robert had been her anchor, her laughter, her purpose. Now she drifted in a house too large and a silence too heavy to bear. Mary's gnarled hands absently traced the outline of her wedding band, worn thin from decades of farm work and devotion. The wind moaned through the eaves, a sound she'd grown accustomed to during these long winter nights. Her nearest neighbor lived almost a mile down the road, close enough for emergencies, far enough that loneliness remained her most faithful companion. She was about to turn away from the window when something changed in the night symphony. A distant rumble cut through the howling wind, mechanical, purposeful, growing louder with each passing second. Mary squinted into the darkness beyond her property line, where the county road disappeared into a wall of swirling white. The rumble transformed into a desperate roar of engines, the sound bouncing off snowdrifts and frozen fields. Headlights suddenly pierced the blizzard's veil, wobbling and weaving down the treacherous road. Mary's heart quickened as the motorcycles, she could see them clearly now, slowed at her gate, their riders hunched against the merciless cold. One by one, the engines fell silent. 20 dark figures stood in her driveway, their leather jackets crusted with ice, their postures speaking of exhaustion and desperation. Mary's fingers tightened around her shawl as she watched them gather at her gate, a mixture of fear and curiosity washing over her weathered face. Mary's heart pounded against her ribs as she peered through the frosted glass. 20 hulking figures stood in the swirling snow, their leather jackets offering little protection against Indiana's merciless winter. The strangers huddled together, shivering violently, their broad shoulders hunched against the biting wind. Even through the weathered door, she could hear their teeth chattering. Fear crept up her spine. Who were these men? What did they want from a widow living alone on the outskirts of town? Her arthritic fingers clutched the faded shawl tighter around her thin shoulders. The rational part of her mind screamed danger. But something else, something deeper, stirred within her chest. What would Robert do? She whispered to herself, her breath fogging the glass. Almost immediately, she could hear her husband's voice, as clear as if he were standing beside her. Always help the traveler. Mary, even if he looks like an enemy. For 15 years, she had lived with his memory, and in moments like these, his wisdom still guided her. The widow's gnarled hand moved to the latch, hesitating for only a moment before sliding it open. The howling wind nearly tore the door from her grasp as she faced the group's leader. Up close, his appearance was even more intimidating. A thick beard crusted with ice, tattoos peeking from beneath his collar, and a face weathered by years on the road. Yet his eyes told a different story, exhausted, pleading, and startlingly human. "Please, ma'am," he said, his deep voice barely audible above the storm. "We don't mean any trouble, we just need warmth." His breath formed clouds in the frigid air as he spoke, and behind him, his companions shifted anxiously, their massive frames seeming to shrink in the cold. Mary Johnson studied the man's face, searching for deceit, but finding only desperation. The biker leader maintained respectful distance, making no move to force his way inside. His restraint, despite obvious suffering, touched something in her heart. Robert would have let them in, she thought. And what do I have to lose anymore? Even with so little left to give, her pantry nearly bare, her savings depleted, her home falling into disrepair, Mary stepped aside, opening her door wider in silent invitation. The simple gesture seemed to release a collective breath among the bikers. "Thank you," the leader murmured as he crossed the threshold, removing his snow-covered boots without being asked. One by one, his men followed suit, each nodding respectfully to the frail woman who had chosen compassion over fear. Steam rose from their soaked jackets as the bikers crowded into Mary Johnson's tiny living room. Their heavy boots stamped against the wooden floorboards, leaving small puddles of melted snow. Their voices remained low, a mixture of gratitude and lingering suspicion as they huddled together, seeking warmth from the modest fire crackling in the hearth. The pungent scent of gasoline and wet leather invaded the space, clashing with the gentle aroma of cedar and tea that had defined Mary's sanctuary for 15 years. These foreign smells overwhelmed the fragile peace of her home, transforming it into something unrecognizable yet oddly alive. Mary stood in the doorway between her kitchen and living room, clutching her faded shawl tighter around her shoulders. She studied their faces, each one marked with scars, adorned with tattoos, eyes narrowed and wary. Yet beneath those tough exteriors, she recognized something familiar, the raw exhaustion of souls beaten down by life's hardships. It reminded her of how Robert would look after returning from long deployments, carrying the weight of experiences he could never fully explain. One of the men, taller than the others, with a gray-streaked beard, nodded respectfully in her direction. "Thank you, ma'am," he said, his voice gravelly but sincere. The others murmured agreement, though their eyes continued to dart around the room, assessing their surroundings. The silence that followed felt taut and fragile, as if a single wrong word might snap the tenuous thread holding these strangers together in the storm. Mary could feel her heart pounding, wondering if she had made a terrible mistake letting these intimidating men into her home. Yet something in their demeanor, a certain restraint, a careful respect for her space, calmed her fears. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows with renewed fury. One of the younger bikers jumped at the sound, his hand instinctively moving to his side before relaxing again. The elderly widow noticed how they positioned themselves, backs to walls, eyes on doors, the habits of men accustomed to danger. "I'll make some tea," Mary finally said, her voice steadier than she felt. "It'll help warm you up." As she turned toward her kitchen, she caught a glimpse of a photograph on her mantel. Robert, in his army uniform, smiling with the confidence of youth. For a moment, she imagined him nodding in approval. These men might look dangerous, but tonight they were simply travelers caught in a storm, just as her husband had once been. Mary retreated to the kitchen, her weathered hands trembling as she surveyed her modest supplies. The old farmhouse kitchen, once filled with Robert's hearty laughter, now held only echoes and memories. She pulled out her last 2 loaves of bread from the wooden cabinet, the hinges creaking in protest. "Robert always said a stranger deserves the best we can offer," she whispered to herself, the words catching in her throat as she sliced the bread with practiced precision. Each slice represented sacrifice. These loaves were meant to last her another 3 days. The widow filled her dented kettle with water and placed it on the ancient stove, the blue flames licking at its base. As if heated, Mary Johnson reached for her chipped ceramic bowls, arranging them in a neat row on the counter. She stirred the thin soup she'd made yesterday, stretching it further with extra water and the last of her dried herbs. Her mind drifted to 15 years earlier, when Robert would come in from tending the fields, his smile warming the room more effectively than any fire. "Nothing brings people together like breaking bread," he'd say, his voice clear in her memory despite the years of silence. The aroma of warm bread and simple soup drifted through the farmhouse, carrying with it an invitation more powerful than words. Mary gathered her courage and carried the first tray into the parlor, where 20 leather-clad strangers shifted uncomfortably on her furniture. The scent worked magic on the bikers' hardened expressions. One by one, their faces softened as hunger overcame wariness. The leader, his ice-crusted beard now thawing in the warmth, was the first to accept a bowl with a gruff, "Thank you, ma'am." His acceptance broke the tension. The others followed, each man taking a bowl and slice of bread with murmured thanks. Mary watched as they ate, noticing how they savored each spoonful of the watery soup as if it were a feast. "This is mighty kind of you," one of the younger riders said, his tattooed hands cradling the chipped bowl carefully. Mary simply nodded, her eyes glistening. It's what anyone would do on a night like this. The men exchanged glances, knowing better. Not everyone would welcome 20 strangers with fearsome appearances into their home during a blizzard. As they ate, the tension in the room gradually dissipated. Quiet conversations began to emerge, and occasional laughter punctuated the howling wind outside. The walls of her lonely home, which had known only silence for so long, now vibrated with the low rumble of voices and the clink of spoons against ceramic. Mary stood in the doorway, watching as life flickered back into her home, if only for one night. For the first time since Robert's passing, the emptiness receded, replaced by the simple warmth of human connection. As the fire crackled in the hearth, casting long shadows across the worn floorboards, the bikers began to share fragments of their journey. Their voices, rough from the cold, filled Mary Johnson's living room with tales of brotherhood and struggle. The blizzard had descended without warning, they explained, scattering their larger convoy across the highways of Indiana. Only these 20 had managed to stay together, fighting through whiteout conditions until their bikes could go no further. "We were heading to a memorial in Louisville," one man with a salt and pepper beard explained, his calloused hands wrapped around a chipped mug, "for a brother we lost last month. Cancer took him quick." Mary nodded, noticing how the others lowered their eyes at the mention of their fallen friend. She recognized that particular silence, the same heavy quiet that had filled her own home after Robert passed. Another biker, younger than the rest, spoke of family waiting states away, worry etched into the lines around his eyes. "My daughter's birthday tomorrow," he said softly. "First one I'll miss." As the night deepened, their stories unfolded like weathered maps. Tales of jobs lost during factory closures, of homes foreclosed, of children growing distant. Behind their leather vests and tattoos, Mary saw men carrying burdens not unlike her own. The weight of debt, the ache of loneliness, the struggle to maintain dignity when the world seemed determined to strip it away. She thought of Robert then, of the nights he'd returned from his army tours, how he would sit by this very fire and speak of the men he'd served with. "Don't judge by appearances, Mary," he'd told her once. "I've seen the gentlest souls wearing the fiercest faces and monsters hiding behind smiles." One biker, noticing her distant gaze, asked about the faded photograph on the mantel, Robert in his uniform, standing tall beside a much younger Mary. "My husband," she replied, her voice steady despite the familiar ache in her chest. "Gone 15 years now." The leader nodded respectfully. "Loss follows us all, ma'am," he said, his deep voice softening. "We've learned to ride with it." In that moment, watching these strangers share her hearth, Mary felt something shift within her. The fear that had initially gripped her heart when they appeared at her door had dissolved completely. Instead of threats, she now saw only fellow travelers weathering their own storms. That night, in the gentle glow of the dying embers, Mary Johnson made a choice. She would see these men not as intruders in her sanctuary, but as souls in need, just as Robert would have done. The clock ticked past midnight as exhaustion settled over Mary Johnson's crowded living room. The bikers slumped against walls and furniture, their weathered faces softened by fatigue and warmth. The crackling fire cast dancing shadows across the room, its light revealing the deep lines etched into their faces by years on the road. Without warning, one of the men, a burly figure with a salt and pepper beard, began to cough. What started as a clearing of the throat quickly escalated into violent, racking spasms that doubled him over. His face turned an alarming shade of red as he clutched his chest, gasping for air between coughs. "He can't breathe!" someone shouted as the biker collapsed to the wooden floor with a heavy thud. The room erupted in panic. Men jumped to their feet, crowding around their fallen brother, voices rising in alarm. Some backed away, unsure what to do, while others called out conflicting advice. Mary's frail frame straightened as if electricity had shot through her spine. The timidity that had marked her movements all evening vanished in an instant. "Everyone back," she commanded, her voice cutting through the chaos with surprising authority. "Give him air." The bikers, men who answered to few, stepped back immediately at her command. Mary knelt beside the struggling man, pressing her palm against his forehead. "Burning up," she muttered. "You," she pointed to a tall biker near the kitchen doorway. "Bring me cold water and a cloth. And you," her finger moved to another, "fetch the extra blankets from the chest upstairs." The men moved without question, responding to the certainty in her voice. Mary loosened the sick man's jacket and propped his head on a cushion, her movements practiced and efficient. "It's pneumonia, most likely," she said, accepting the damp cloth and placing it on his forehead. "Been building for days, I'd wager." The biker's breathing eased slightly under her care. She wrapped him in blankets, elevating his head, and mixed honey into warm water for his throat. Her weathered hands moved with the confidence of someone who had nursed many through illness. The room fell silent as the group watched her work. The leader stood nearby, his arms crossed over his chest, eyes never leaving Mary as she tended to his man with the same care she might show her own child. "My Robert caught pneumonia 3 winters in a row," she explained softly. Adjusting the blanket, "You learn what works." By the time the sick biker's breathing steadied into sleep, something had shifted in the room. The wariness in the men's eyes had been replaced by something else. Respect, perhaps even reverence, for this widow who had not only opened her door, but now fought to save one of their own. The first light of day painted the Indiana countryside in gentle hues of pink and gold. Dawn crept across the snow, turning the world outside pale and still as Mary Johnson moved through her weathered farmhouse with practiced efficiency. Despite her frail frame, there was purpose in her movements as she prepared breakfast for her unexpected guests. She scrambled the few eggs remaining in her pantry and warmed the last of her milk on the ancient stove that had served her family for decades. The aroma of cooking food stirred the 20 bikers from their makeshift beds on her living room floor. They rose quietly, exchanging glances but few words, their tough exteriors softened by the night's shared vulnerability. The widow watched them from the corner of her eye, noting how different they seemed in the morning light, less threatening, more human. "Breakfast is ready," she announced, her voice stronger than her appearance suggested. "It's not much, but it's warm." The men lined up at her small kitchen table without protest, each waiting his turn with unexpected patience. Mary served them one by one, portioning the modest meal carefully to ensure everyone received their share. As she placed each plate before them, the bikers bowed their heads, some in prayer, others in simple gratitude, before accepting her offering. "Thank you, ma'am," murmured the bearded leader, his weathered face solemn as he received his portion. "Your kindness won't be forgotten." Mary nodded, remembering Robert's words about the importance of hospitality. Her late husband would have approved of her actions, despite the intimidating appearance of these men. As she watched them eat, she noticed calloused hands handling her chipped dishes with surprising care, tattoo-covered arms passing salt with unexpected gentleness. The silence in the room wasn't uncomfortable anymore. The icy barrier that had existed when they first arrived, the suspicion, the fear, the uncertainty, had thawed overnight, replaced by a quiet humility that neither side could fully explain. They were no longer strangers thrown together by circumstance, but people who had weathered something meaningful together. Outside, the snow continued to glisten under the strengthening sunlight. Inside, Mary refilled coffee cups and offered second helpings where she could. For a brief moment, her lonely farmhouse felt alive again, filled with the simple sounds of life that had been absent for too long. What neither Mary nor her guests realized was how this shared meal would pale in comparison to what was about to unfold on her quiet country road, an event that would forever change the rhythm of her solitary existence. For a fleeting moment, Mary Johnson allowed herself to believe the worst was over. The pale winter sun had risen, casting long shadows across her worn kitchen floor. She watched the bikers finishing the last of her meager breakfast, their movements more relaxed than the night before. Perhaps they would simply thank her, mount their motorcycles, and disappear down the road, leaving her to the familiar silence of her farmhouse. "More coffee?" she asked, lifting the dented pot. A few nodded gratefully, extending their chipped mugs. The widow noticed how they avoided her eyes, not from rudeness but something else, a shared secret perhaps, or an unspoken concern. As Mary refilled their cups, she sensed the tension vibrating between them. The men exchanged glances, their weathered faces communicating without words. They kept glancing toward the frosted windows, their ears seemingly tuned to something beyond the walls of her home. One biker, his arms covered in faded tattoos, repeatedly checked his wristwatch. Another paced near the door, peering through the curtains at the snow-covered lane. "Everything all right?" she ventured, her voice barely audible above the ticking of the old wall clock, a wedding gift from Robert all those years ago. The leader looked up, his bearded face softening momentarily. "Yes, ma'am, just waiting." Waiting for what? Mary clutched her shawl tighter around her thin shoulders. He hesitated, exchanging another meaningful glance with his companions. For the storm to clear completely, roads should be passable soon. But Mary had lived alone too long not to recognize evasion. These men weren't concerned about road conditions. They were listening for something specific, something expected. The silence hanging in her kitchen wasn't peaceful, it was charged with anticipation. Her hands trembled slightly as she collected empty plates. What had she invited into her home? Robert's voice echoed in her memory. "Trust your instincts, Mary. They rarely lead you wrong." Her instincts now whispered caution, yet something deeper, perhaps the same compassion that had opened her door last night, told her to wait and see. The widow busied herself at the sink, stealing glances at her guests. Despite her unease, she couldn't bring herself to regret sheltering them. Their gratitude had seemed genuine, their respect for her home evident in how carefully they handled her belongings. Mary dried her hands on a threadbare towel and straightened her back. Whatever was coming, she would face it with dignity. Perhaps, just this once, her act of kindness would be repaid with kindness. Perhaps the world wasn't as cold as 15 years of solitude had led her to believe. The dishes in Mary Johnson's kitchen clattered against each other as the floor beneath them began to vibrate. She froze, spatula in hand, watching as ripples formed in the cup of coffee she'd just poured. The 20 bikers exchanged knowing glances, their bodies tensing as they recognized what was coming. "What is that?" Mary asked, her voice barely audible above the growing rumble. No one answered. Instead, the leader moved swiftly to the window, his weathered face hardening as he peered through the frost-edged glass. The thunder grew louder, no longer distant, but immediate and overwhelming, a physical force that seemed to compress the air inside the farmhouse. "They found us," one of the men muttered, his tattooed hands gripping the edge of Mary's worn kitchen table. Mary shuffled to the window, her frail shoulders brushing against the biker leader's leather jacket. What she saw made her gasp. Emerging from the morning mist like an apparition, a massive convoy of motorcycles flowed down her narrow country lane. Hundreds, no, thousands of riders in formation, their chrome exhaust pipes gleaming in the winter sunlight, their engines creating a symphony of mechanical power that made the very air tremble. "My God," she whispered, one hand flying to her throat. The endless procession of bikes stretched beyond where she could see, disappearing around the bend in the road. They moved with military precision, 2 by 2, their riders wrapped in leather and denim, faces obscured by helmets and the morning's lingering fog. The snow-covered fields on either side of her property reflected the sunlight onto their polished gas tanks, creating flashes of brilliance that dazzled the eye. "Who are they?" Mary asked, turning to the leader, whose expression remained unreadable. "Family," he answered simply, his eyes never leaving the approaching horde. The 20 men who had spent the night under her roof moved with sudden purpose, gathering their few belongings, straightening their jackets, and nodding to each other in silent communication. Outside, neighbors were emerging from their homes, standing in driveways and porches to witness the unprecedented spectacle unfolding on their quiet street. Mary felt her heart hammering against her ribs as the first riders reached her gate. The farmhouse that had known only silence for 15 years was now the epicenter of a gathering storm. 1,000 motorcycles, 1,000 riders, all converging on her doorstep like a metal tide washing over the land. "What do they want?" she asked, her voice trembling as much as her hands. The leader turned to her, his expression softening for just a moment. "You'll see," he said, and moved toward the door. The bikers inside Mary Johnson's home froze, their faces turning ashen as the roar grew deafening. Forks clattered against plates, conversations died mid-sentence, and 20 pairs of eyes darted toward the windows. The leader's hand instinctively moved to his belt, his weathered face hardening with concern. "Stay inside," he commanded, his voice barely audible above the growing thunder. Mary staggered to the window, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. The sight before her seemed impossible, a river of chrome and leather pouring down her narrow lane, sunlight flashing off polished tanks. Hundreds, perhaps 1,000 riders descended on her property, their machines forming a living, breathing organism that encircled her weathered farmhouse. "Sweet Lord," she whispered, fingers pressing against the cold glass. The vibrations traveled through the floorboards, rattling the china cabinet where Robert's mother's dishes had sat untouched for years. Even the walls seemed to tremble beneath the collective roar. The quiet Indiana morning had transformed into something otherworldly. Engines snarled and growled, chrome gleamed blindingly in the sharp morning light, and leather-clad figures sat astride their machines like ancient warriors. They moved with military precision, forming concentric circles around her property, tightening like a noose. Across the street, Mrs. Peterson's curtains twitched. 2 houses down, the Millers stood frozen on their porch, coffee mugs suspended midair. All along the once peaceful lane, neighbors peeked from behind windows and doors, fear and awe etched across their faces. In 20 years, the most excitement this street had seen was a lost delivery truck or the occasional deer wandering through someone's garden. Now it had become a coliseum of steel and thunder. Mary clutched the doorframe, her knees threatening to buckle beneath her. The shawl that had comforted her through 15 years of widowhood offered no protection against this invasion. Her fingers traced the worn wood, where Robert had once measured their son's height, year after year, until he too had left her. "What have I done?" she thought, watching as the massive gathering continued to grow. "What have I invited into my home?" The 20 men she'd sheltered exchanged glances loaded with unspoken messages. Their leader moved toward the door with deliberate steps, his shoulders squared. Mary's breath caught in her throat as she wondered if her simple act of kindness, offering shelter against the bitter cold, had somehow brought ruin upon her home, and perhaps the entire neighborhood. "Ma'am," the leader said, his voice surprisingly gentle as he approached her trembling form, "you might want to stay back." The 20 bikers, Mary Johnson's unexpected guests, filed out onto the weathered porch, their leather boots creaking against the wooden planks. They formed a solid wall of humanity, shoulder to shoulder, facing the mechanical tsunami that had descended upon the quiet Indiana farmhouse. The morning sun glinted off chrome and metal as far as the eye could see, hundreds of motorcycles surrounding the property like a steel ocean. Mary stood frozen in the doorway, her thin fingers gripping the frame for support. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she watched the leader of her guests step forward. His posture radiated a calm authority that seemed at odds with the chaos unfolding around them. With deliberate slowness, he raised one gloved hand into the air. The gesture was simple, but carried unmistakable weight. Immediately, as if connected by some invisible current, the roaring engines began to die one by one. The thunderous noise that had shaken the foundations of Mary's home faded into an eerie silence. The quiet that followed was profound, unnatural in its completeness. Even the birds that normally chattered in the old oak tree beside the house seemed to hold their breath. The only sound was the soft whisper of the winter wind across the snow-covered fields. Mary's gaze darted from face to face among the sea of riders. Where she expected to find menace, she instead saw something unexpected: respect. These weren't men who had come to threaten. They stood at attention like soldiers, awaiting orders. The widow's fear began to dissolve, replaced by a bewilderment that left her speechless. She had simply offered shelter to strangers in need, following the wisdom Robert had shared during their years together. Never could she have imagined this response. The leader turned toward Mary, his weathered face solemn beneath his beard. Their eyes met across the distance, and something passed between them, a recognition that transcended words. He took 3 measured steps toward the porch, his boots crunching in the snow, and stopped at the bottom step. Around them, 1,000 riders remained perfectly still, their helmets removed, heads slightly bowed. The silence held a reverence that Mary couldn't comprehend. What had she done to deserve such deference from these hardened men? The frail woman straightened her shoulders, summoning strength she didn't know she possessed. Whatever was happening, she would face it with dignity. As the leader's gaze remained fixed upon her, Mary felt the weight of something momentous about to unfold, something that would forever change the quiet desperation that had defined her existence since Robert's passing. "These men ride for me. Last night, you saved their lives." The leader's voice carried across the sea of leather and chrome, each word clear despite the morning breeze. His weathered face turned toward Mary, eyes locking with hers in a moment of profound connection. Mary felt the weight of his words like a physical force. Her knees weakened as she gripped the porch railing. She had simply followed her heart, opening her door to strangers in need, just as Robert would have wanted. Never had she imagined the ripples her small act of kindness would create. "I didn't do anything special," she whispered, though only those closest could hear her trembling voice. The leader shook his head. "You gave shelter when others would have called the police. You shared your food when you had little to spare. You treated my brothers with dignity." Around him, the massive gathering remained eerily silent. One by one, the bikers removed their helmets, revealing faces that told stories of hard roads and harder lives. Some bore scars, others tattoos that climbed up their necks. Gray-haired veterans sat alongside younger riders, their expressions unified in something Mary had never expected: respect. Then, as if orchestrated by an unspoken command, the sea of men bowed their heads in unison. 1,000 riders, tough men who feared little in this world, lowered their gaze in tribute to the elderly widow who had shown mercy to their brothers. Mary's hand flew to her mouth as tears welled in her eyes. The silence was deafening, more powerful than any roar of engines. Neighbors peered from windows and doorways, witnessing the extraordinary scene unfolding on their quiet street. The leader remained standing tall, his beard catching the morning light. "In our world, loyalty means everything," he continued. "When someone stands by us, we stand by them, 1,000 strong if necessary." Mary thought of Robert then, wondering what he would make of this moment. Her late husband had always believed in the goodness of people, regardless of their appearance. She could almost feel his presence beside her, his hand on her shoulder. "Thank you," she managed, her voice stronger now, despite the tears tracking down her weathered cheeks. The leader nodded once, a gesture of profound respect. Behind him, the bowed heads remained lowered, a living monument to the power of compassion. The morning sun climbed higher, glinting off chrome and warming the cold Indiana air, as 1,000 strangers honored the frail widow who had opened not just her door, but her heart. Tears welled in Mary Johnson's eyes as the leader stepped toward her, his weathered face softened by the morning light. Despite his imposing figure, there was a gentleness in his approach that calmed her racing heart. The crowd of bikers fell silent, creating a bubble of quiet reverence around them. "You don't remember me, do you?" he asked, his voice low enough that only she could hear. Mary shook her head, confusion creasing her brow. 7 years ago, I was riding alone through Indiana. Got caught in a blizzard worse than last night's." He gestured toward one of the 20 men who had spent the night in her home. "That's Mike over there. He was with your guests last night, but back then, it was just me, half dead from pneumonia when I knocked on your door." Recognition dawned slowly across Mary's face as fragments of memory surfaced. A feverish stranger collapsed on her porch, delirious and burning with fever. She had dragged him inside, nursed him through 3 days of illness, never learning more than his first name. "You fed me soup from those same chipped bowls," he continued, nodding toward her house. "Gave me Robert's old sweater. Sat up all night, pressing cold cloths to my forehead when the fever wouldn't break." The widow's hand trembled as she reached out, almost touching his leather jacket before pulling back. "I never knew if you made it," she whispered. "You left before dawn on the 4th day. I found $20 on the table." "It was all I had," he admitted. "But I never forgot. I told everyone I met about the widow who saved my life when no one else would stop for a man like me." Behind him, Mike removed his helmet completely, revealing a face Mary now recognized despite the years that had passed. He nodded respectfully, confirming the leader's story. "For 7 years, I've been telling my brothers about Mary Johnson and her farmhouse in Indiana," the leader continued, his voice carrying just enough for the front row of bikers to hear. "About how kindness can come from the most unexpected places." He turned to face the assembled riders, raising his voice. "We will not leave owing you," he declared, the promise echoing across the sea of leather and chrome. "A debt of life can never truly be repaid. But we're damn well going to try." The 1,000 bikers remained motionless, their collective silence more powerful than any roar of engines. Mary stood transfixed, realizing that her small act of mercy, opening her door to a stranger on a stormy night, had rippled outward through the years, returning to her doorstep with the force of a tidal wave. The rumble of diesel engines cut through the morning air as 3 pickup trucks rolled into view, their beds stacked high with lumber, roofing materials, and toolboxes. Mary Johnson watched in bewilderment as the vehicles parked alongside her weathered fence. The scene before her was unlike anything she'd witnessed in all her years in rural Indiana. Men broke away from the mass of bikers, moving with purpose toward her porch. 4 of them carried thick manila envelopes, their leather vests adorned with patches she couldn't quite make out. The leader nodded at them, and they approached Mary with a reverence that made her heart flutter. "Ma'am," one said, extending the first envelope, "your property taxes for the next 5 years." Another step forward. "Your outstanding medical bills." A third. "The mortgage." The fourth. "Utility payments through winter." Mary's hands trembled as she accepted them, papers sliding out to reveal official letterheads stamped "Paid in Full." Her vision blurred with tears as 15 years of financial burden evaporated in seconds. Meanwhile, dozens of bikers swarmed toward her barn, its paint peeling and boards sagging from years of neglect. They moved with the coordination of men who'd worked together for years, assessing damage, measuring beams, and unloading supplies from the trucks. Others disappeared around the sides of her farmhouse with ladders, paint cans, and toolboxes. The sharp rap of hammers and buzz of saws filled the air, where moments before there had been only engine noise. "What are you doing?" Mary finally managed to ask, her voice barely audible above the commotion. She clutched the envelopes to her chest, afraid they might somehow vanish. The bearded leader approached, removing his gloves. His weathered face softened as he looked at the elderly woman. "Paying back a debt," he said simply. 15 years ago, you took in a stranger during a storm like last night's, nursed him through pneumonia, never asked his name." He gestured toward one of the 20 men she'd sheltered. "That was my brother. You saved his life when no one else would open their door." Mary's memory flickered to that night. A half-dead rider collapsed on her porch during a blizzard. Robert had been alive then, helping her carry the man inside. "But this is too much," she whispered. The leader shook his head. "For us, it's nothing. For you," he glanced at the farmhouse that had protected his brother, "it's everything." Around them, the Brotherhood worked tirelessly, transforming decay into renewal, one board and nail at a time. The rhythmic percussion of hammers filled the Indiana morning as dozens of bikers transformed into skilled laborers. They worked with methodical precision, their leather jackets discarded for the serious business of reconstruction. Mary Johnson watched from her porch, a steaming mug clutched in her trembling hands, as weathered shingles came crashing down from her roof, replaced by fresh ones that gleamed in the winter sunlight. "We've got dry rot on the east side," called one tattooed man, his arms covered in intricate designs that disappeared beneath rolled-up sleeves. Another nodded and hauled over replacement boards, their golden hue standing in stark contrast to the gray-worn wood of the farmhouse. The widow moved slowly around her property, witnessing the transformation with disbelieving eyes. Men who hours before had been strangers seeking shelter now scaled ladders with paint cans, covering decades of neglect with fresh coats of warm beige. The color had been Robert's favorite. Somehow they knew, or perhaps it was coincidence that felt like fate. "Ma'am, where would you like this firewood stacked?" A burly man with a salt-and-pepper beard approached her, his respectful tone matching his careful movements. Mary pointed wordlessly toward the side of the house, where Robert had always kept their winter supply. Inside her home, the pantry doors stood open as bikers carefully arranged provisions: flour, sugar, beans, rice, and canned goods, enough to last through several harsh Indiana winters. The shelves that had echoed with emptiness for years now groaned under the weight of abundance. "The horses need to be settled," someone called from outside. Mary hurried to the window, watching as 3 magnificent chestnut mares were led toward the barn that had stood empty since Robert sold their last livestock to pay for his medical bills. The animals tossed their heads, manes catching the light as they explored their new home. Everywhere she looked, hands that once gripped motorcycle throttles now wielded tools with reverence: hammers, paintbrushes, saws, and shovels, all employed in service of restoring what time and poverty had stolen from her. These men moved with the synchronized efficiency of a brotherhood accustomed to working as one. The leader supervised from the center of the yard, occasionally pointing or offering quiet direction, but mostly allowing his men to work with the dignity of their purpose. When his eyes met Mary's across the bustling yard, he offered a simple nod, acknowledgement of a debt being repaid with honor rather than obligation. By midday, the farmhouse had begun to resemble the home it had once been when Robert was alive, sturdy, welcoming, and prepared to withstand whatever storms might come. Mary stood in silent wonder, watching as strangers restored not just her dwelling, but her faith in humanity itself. The once wary townspeople gathered at the edge of Mary Johnson's property, their expressions shifting from fear to wonder. Families who had lived alongside the widow for years but rarely spoke to her now stood in clusters, watching as leather-clad strangers transformed her crumbling homestead. What had begun as a terrifying invasion had become something none of them could have imagined, an act of collective restoration. "I've never seen anything like it," whispered Eleanor from 2 houses down, clutching her cardigan against the morning chill. "Those men we've been taught to fear are rebuilding her entire life." Children from the neighborhood pressed their faces against frosted windows, their breath creating small clouds on the glass as they watched the spectacle unfold. Some of the braver ones ventured closer, standing beside their parents with wide eyes as the bikers moved with surprising precision and care. Mary stood on her porch, utterly still except for the tears that streamed unchecked down her weathered cheeks. Her thin frame seemed frozen in disbelief as she watched her dilapidated farmhouse transform before her eyes. The home that had been slowly crumbling around her for 15 years since Robert's passing was being reborn through the hands of strangers. "They're not doing this out of pity," observed the town's hardware store owner, who had arrived after hearing the commotion. "Look at their faces. This is about respect." Indeed, the bikers worked with solemn purpose, their movements deliberate and careful. They handled each board, nail, and brush with reverence, as though they were restoring something sacred. No loud jokes, no horsing around, just the steady rhythm of hammers, the scrape of ladders against siding, and the occasional murmured instruction. One particularly weathered biker, his arms covered in faded tattoos, painstakingly repaired the porch railing where Mary had nearly fallen last winter. Another carefully rehung the door that had been listing on its hinges for years. These weren't rushed repairs, but meticulous restorations, done with the care of craftsmen rather than hurried volunteers. The neighbors who had long whispered about poor Mary and her declining property now watched in silent shame as strangers honored her in a way the community never had. "She took them in," said a young mother, bouncing her baby on her hip. "When most of us would have called the sheriff, she opened her door." As the morning progressed, Mary finally moved from her spot, reaching out to touch the fresh paint with trembling fingers. The men paused in their work, nodding respectfully before continuing their labor. This wasn't charity being bestowed upon a pitiful widow. This was a debt being repaid with honor to a woman whose courage had earned the respect of 1,000 riders. The transformation was nothing short of miraculous. What had stood as a crumbling testament to Mary Johnson's solitude now gleamed in the crisp Indiana morning. Fresh white paint brightened the farmhouse walls, contrasting with the newly repaired shutters that framed each window. The once sagging porch stood level and strong, while the repaired roof no longer threatened to surrender to winter's weight. Even the chimney, repointed and proud, sent plumes of smoke curling into the cloudless sky. Mary stepped through her front door onto the porch, momentarily disoriented by the sight before her. The weathered shawl that had been her constant companion slipped from her shoulders, forgotten. Her eyes, rimmed with tears, took in the sea of leather-clad figures who had labored through the morning without complaint or fanfare. "I don't know what to say," she whispered, her voice catching as she surveyed her transformed property. The fence lines stood straight and true. The barn door hung properly on its hinges, and stacked firewood promised warmth for months to come. The biker who had fallen ill the night before approached, now recovered and standing tall. "You gave when you had nothing to give," he said simply, his scarred hands clasping hers briefly before he turned away. One by one, the men began moving toward their motorcycles. The vehicles that had once filled her with dread now seemed almost dignified, their chrome catching the sunlight as leather-gloved hands gripped handlebars and kickstands were raised. The engines started not in chaotic bursts, but in a synchronized rumble that seemed to Mary like the solemn notes of a church organ. The sound vibrated through the floorboards beneath her feet, a physical reminder of the power these men commanded, power they had channeled into renewal rather than destruction. As they prepared to depart, each rider acknowledged the widow in his own way. Some offered formal nods, others touched fingers to foreheads in silent salute. A few raised 2 fingers from their handlebars as they passed, a gesture of respect typically reserved for fellow riders. Mary stood taller than she had in 15 years, her frailty momentarily forgotten as she returned each acknowledgement. These men, strangers just hours before, had honored her simple act of kindness with something far greater than charity. They had restored not just her home, but her place in the world. The neighbors who had gathered at a safe distance watched in stunned silence as the widow and the bikers shared this wordless communion, a testament to how quickly fear could transform into awe when confronted with unexpected grace. The biker leader dismounted his motorcycle, his weathered boots crunching on the freshly shoveled driveway. He approached Mary Johnson with measured steps, his imposing frame casting a long shadow across the pristine snow. No grand speech passed his lips, only a silent nod that conveyed what 1,000 words never could. The gesture carried the collective gratitude of his brotherhood, a debt acknowledged and honored. Mary returned his nod, her thin shoulders squared with newfound strength. Tears welled in her eyes, catching the midday sunlight like diamonds as they traced paths down her weathered cheeks. The widow's hands, which had once trembled with fear at these strangers, now rested steady at her sides. "Your kindness won't be forgotten," he said simply, his voice barely audible above the idling engines. She found no words adequate for this moment, this impossible transformation of her life. Instead, she reached out and briefly touched his leather-clad arm, a gesture as profound as his had been. The leader returned to his motorcycle, its chrome gleaming in the winter sun. With a signal that rippled through the assembled riders, he guided his vehicle to the head of the formation. The bikers arranged themselves in perfect order, their machines rumbling with subdued power as they prepared for departure. Down Mary's Lane they rode, not in chaotic clusters, but in a solemn procession that stretched beyond sight. The disciplined column moved with deliberate slowness, each rider passing her restored home with reverence. Some offered salutes, others nodded respectfully. Many placed hands over their hearts, 1,000 individual acknowledgments to the woman who had changed their collective world with a single night of compassion. The neighbors who had cowered behind curtains now emerged from their homes. They lined the street, their faces transformed from fear to wonder as they witnessed this extraordinary tribute. Children perched on parents' shoulders, pointing at the endless parade of motorcycles. Elderly residents stood with hands clasped over their mouths, disbelief evident in their wide eyes. "Who is she?" whispered one neighbor to another, seeing Mary in an entirely new light. "Someone who remembered what the rest of us forgot," came the reply. As the procession continued, Mary stood framed in the doorway of her transformed home. The farmhouse that had once been a symbol of her isolation now stood as a monument to unexpected connection. For the first time in 15 years, she felt Robert's presence not as a painful absence, but as a guiding light that had led her to this extraordinary moment. The widow watched until the last motorcycle disappeared over the horizon, leaving behind only the lingering rumble of engines and a street full of neighbors who would never see her or themselves the same way again. As the last engine faded into the horizon, Mary stood tall, her frailty forgotten, framed against the newly painted walls of her home. The silence they left behind was not hollow, but alive with promise and memory. The neighbors who had gathered in the street began to approach her porch, their faces filled with questions and wonder. "Mary Johnson," whispered Mrs. Peterson from next door. "What just happened here?" The widow simply smiled, her weathered hands steady for the first time in years. "Kindness came back around," she answered softly, turning to survey her transformed farmhouse. The fresh paint gleamed in the afternoon sun. The repaired roof stood strong against the Indiana sky, and the once empty barn now housed horses that nickered softly in their new home. Throughout the day, people from town drove by slowly, their vehicles crawling past as they stared in disbelief at the miracle that had unfolded on this quiet street. Some stopped to offer congratulations. Others simply nodded in newfound respect. Mary accepted their attention with quiet dignity, neither boasting nor explaining the debt that had been repaid. As evening settled over the farmhouse, she lit a fire in the hearth and prepared a simple meal in her kitchen, now stocked with provisions that would last through winter and beyond. The home that had felt so empty for 15 years since Robert's passing now seemed filled with invisible presences. Not ghosts, but echoes of connection and humanity. That night, Mary sat by her window, the moonlight soft on the snow, her heart at peace for the first time in 15 years. She gazed at the quiet street where just hours before, 1,000 motorcycles had thundered in tribute. The neighbors' homes were dark now, their windows no longer peering out in fear, but closed in peaceful slumber. On the table beside her lay a single leather glove, the leader's silent token, left as a covenant between strangers who had become family. Mary ran her fingers over the worn leather, feeling the creases where a strong hand had gripped handlebars through countless miles. This small piece of another life now connected her to a brotherhood that stretched across highways and state lines. She held the glove to her heart, remembering the leader's final nod before he mounted his motorcycle, a gesture that contained more gratitude than words could express. In that moment, Mary understood that she was no longer alone in the world. Somewhere out there, 1,000 riders carried her story with them, and that connection would remain long after the rumble of engines had faded from memory. Mary closed her hand around the leather glove, its worn surface telling stories of open roads and distant horizons. She whispered a prayer into the quiet of her farmhouse, not for herself, but for the men who had thundered into her life and reminded her that compassion returns 1,000-fold. The prayer wasn't elaborate, just simple words of gratitude and protection for those who had transformed her world in a single day. Through her newly repaired window, the Indiana countryside stretched before her, peaceful under moonlight. Mary Johnson imagined the bikers somewhere out there, their engines a distant rumble, carrying her story across highways and through small towns, just like hers. Perhaps they were telling others about the widow who had opened her door when the world was cold and unforgiving. She ran her fingers over the token left behind, the leader's personal covenant. The man whose life she had saved years ago, without ever knowing his name, had remembered her kindness when it mattered most. Mary smiled, thinking how Robert would have approved. Her late husband had always believed in the ripple effect of good deeds, how they spread outward like stones cast in still water. The widow glanced around her restored home, hardly believing the transformation. Just yesterday, she had been drowning in debt and despair. Now, her pantry was full, her roof no longer leaked, and the crushing weight of financial burden had been lifted from her shoulders. One meal, she whispered to herself. Just one warm meal on a cold night. That was all it had taken. A simple act of kindness when fear would have been easier. Mary thought of her neighbors, how they had watched in disbelief as an army of leather-clad men had rebuilt what time had broken. Perhaps they too would remember this lesson. She placed the glove carefully on her bedside table and prepared for sleep, her heart lighter than it had been in 15 years. The farmhouse creaked comfortably around her, solid and secure once more. As the wind stirred the quiet street, Mary realized that sometimes the smallest act could shake the very ground beneath us. A cup of tea, a slice of bread, a moment of compassion when the world turns its back. These things matter more than we know. If kindness could summon 1,000 engines for an elderly widow in a forgotten corner of Indiana, what might it summon for you? The question hung in the air like a promise as Mary drifted to sleep, the memory of thunder still echoing in her dreams. Be kind. The world is listening.